Okay, welcome everybody. Today I have Harriet Lerner, author of many amazing books. One of them is The Dance of Anger, The Dance of Connection, and I think your latest book is Why Won't You Apologize? Is that right, Harriet?
That's right.
Thanks so much for being here today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Mhm. So today we talked about covering the mother-daughter relationship, and so we're kind of going to just dive right in there. Right before we started recording, I was sort of giving you a little bit of my background, which is why I'm so drawn to this work, and just how difficult mother and daughter relationships can be for all of us, no matter, if we had really severe trauma in that relationship or if it was fairly quote easy. I think that the dynamic between mother and daughter is just, there's so much there to unravel, and I want to hear your thoughts on that today so that we can maybe learn how to navigate difficult conversations and boundaries in a healthier way.
Great. So, where should we start?
Why don't we talk about why the mother-daughter relationship is so impactful? Like, why does it have such an impact on us? And then we can kind of go into a little bit more about um, what that looks like and how it impacts us in the world when we have that, troublesome or broken, maybe even relationship with our mothers. How does that show up in our lives?
Well, I think maybe I'll start with just the role of motherhood, the institution of motherhood. I think it was first Adrienne Rich who pointed out that we need to separate out the institution of motherhood, the roles and rules under patriarchy,
Mhm.
and the experience of mothering. So, first, I would say it's just incredibly hard to be a mother. It's a job description that is impossible. No one can live up to that job description. And mothers, historians of motherhood remind us that mothers have forever been either glorified or blamed. Like we either have this romantic idealization of the power of mothers, or mothers are held up as a target of just unmitigated denigration. And mother blaming, when I was trained, I'm thinking of my early training at the Menninger Foundation. And back then, and I don't know how much it's changed, but all of pathology, all of children's problems, in trying to understand them, they were sort of a backwards, linear, whodunit game that pointed the finger in mother's direction.
Mhm.
Um, so, and and every category of mother needs respect and economic protection and recognition and institutional support and connection to family and friends who care about mothers. And I just think mothers operate in very difficult circumstances, and nowhere is the personal so political as in the mother-daughter relationship.
Mhm.
So daughters, adult daughters, are bound to be angry and disappointed at their mothers, often without knowing their mother's history, not knowing what their mother was up against, not knowing the forces that have come down the generations, and not knowing how patriarchy has made things so impossibly difficult.
Mhm.
So that's my first thought. And
Mhm.
before we started, you were talking about authenticity and how important that is.
Mhm.
And work, I've worked with so many adult daughters, and that's what they want. They want to authentically be able to be who they are with their mother,
Mhm.
of course. And the complexity of that for me is that in the name of authenticity and in the name of truth telling, I so often see daughters blasting their mothers or parachuting down on their mothers and bringing up the most difficult issue that hasn't been talked about in generations. And they bring it up in a very angry, confrontive way, and their mother gets defensive, surprise, surprise. And then the daughter goes back to her therapist and says, you see, my mother is just so defensive. I can't have a relationship with her, and there's nothing to do but distance. Mm-hmm. And the challenge, what I find most compelling as a therapist is to help daughters find their voice with their mother in a way that's going to lead to more connection and is going to actually build the relationship rather than blow it to pieces, and build their sense of self. And it's very possible to do that, to have a voice where you can say very difficult things and to do it in a way that will at least give the relationship the best chance of growing, and the best chance of being mutually enhancing and mutually empowering. And to get there are a number of steps or things that one needs to be willing to experiment in doing, I think.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned the patriarchal construct of motherhood and just these pressures and ideals that we put on motherhood. It reminds me of, have you read any of Maureen Murdock's work, the Heroines journey? And she talks a lot about this, how, we put all of this emphasis on the mother, and then we pedestal the father archetype. And so there's just a lot of imbalance and blame. And I don't think that we realize that that's the lens that we're coming through when we're working on these relationships with our mothers. But what it reminds me of is a time where I was navigating my own mother wound. I was really, really heavy in that work. And I had this experience of sort of seeing a splitting off of my mom. So I almost saw her like split into two different bubbles. And on the left, there was mother archetype. And mother archetype owed me something. Like, she had to be a certain way. She owed me love. She owed me protection. She owed me so many things. And then on the other side, there was just a woman. And this woman had been through her own trauma, and she was just fighting to survive. And she gave me a life, and that was all that she had to give. And it really dropped me into compassion, where I was able to really let go of that archetype in my mind of, you owe me something. And just to see her as another woman on a journey, and to really feel that compassion. So when you said it the way that you said it, it really reminded me of how we sort of make mothers gods, and the only place that they can go from there is to fall. Right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think it's so hard to come to a place of compassion when our mothers have behaved badly, which they will, mm-hmm. because we all have stories about our mothers, and we all have diagnoses. Like, people come to see me and they say, my mother is borderline, my mother is narcissistic. And we don't want our stories interrupted with the facts. So there's often a great resistance to really asking our mothers about their own history, becoming a really good questioner, if we're lucky enough, to have our mother there to question. And just a recent example of that, Shay, that came to mind is, I have a woman in therapy, or actually had, this is from some time back, who had a very difficult mother, and who had very strong fundamentalist religious views. And at first, my client in therapy was afraid to tell her mother that she was in therapy, even though therapy was very important to her. And that was a kind of de-selfing. In other words, she wasn't able to be authentic with her mother and say, have to go now, I have a therapy appointment, because she was so afraid of her mother's anger and disapproval. So the first step, because to really find your voice with your mother, you do need to be able to say what you think and feel about things that matter and what's real. So she finally did come to a point where she mentioned, gotta go, have a therapy appointment. And as she anticipated, in fact, her mother got very reactive and very upset. And then, and in, many times thereafter, would tell her that therapy was not just worthless, but bad, and that she should go to church and she should pray and ask Jesus for help. And she would fight with her mother, and then she would distance from her mother, and this went on. And a very, very courageous thing she did is make a change in that and begin to ask her mother questions that helped her to understand where her mother was coming from. So when her mother went off in her therapy as the bad influence and, you should pray instead and go to church, she began to ask her mother about where she got her religious views and the ways in which religion had been really, really helpful to her, and asked her mother how her mother, grandmother, had reacted when mother left the family church and chose a different church, learned that her grandmother had cut her mother off for many years for that. So down the generations, there was not much of a tolerance for difference between mothers and daughters. And then in the conversation, for the first time, she asked her mother about her views about therapy. Where did they come from? And she assumed that it was because, the preacher or whatever said that therapy was an evil thing. She learned something she had never known. She learned that mother's aunt, who was really a terribly important person to mother, had gone into a mental institution, had terrible, scary treatment, and really never emerged. And that her mother never got over losing her sister to bad psychiatry. And that really, and her ability to listen to her mother's story about this without defensiveness, to really listen, brought her to a place of more compassion about her mother having zero tolerance for therapy. And they were able then to really talk about it in a more authentic way, because the fighting about it was a lot of emotional reactivity flying around. It wasn't really a person-to-person conversation. And she was able to really understand her mother's fear and to say that therapy was important to her. She said, I'm different than you in that way, Mom. I do find it helpful. And sometimes I feel that I'm spinning my wheels and it's not being that useful, but it's something that is really important for me to give a good try. And, I just want to assure you that the process I have is not the process that Aunt Betty, went through, which was so tragic. So I think that ability, that one place that compassion comes from is really being able to ask questions around the hot issues, that we can know our mother as a real person who had a very complicated history of her own before we even came into the picture.
Yeah. Inherited belief systems and her own traumas and her own past that shaped her. And again, it comes back to this idea that, we put mother in a box. Mother is just mother. We separate her from almost human with your own story. And so we have these really tall orders and expectations. And so what I'm hearing is that it's all about curiosity, which is hard to do, because when we have all of these beliefs that our mother should be a certain way or give us something, we can feel entitled to her energy and not think to maybe stop and actually ask questions and get curious. That's kind of where we learn about our own programming and our own beliefs that maybe we're carrying on. So this kind of leads me to ask you a little bit more about inherited family trauma, and specifically around the mother. I've read Dr. Christiane Northrup's book, Mother-Daughter Wisdom, the really thick one. It's like a Bible almost. It's huge. And she mentions in there something about how when we are in our mother's womb, like we're already downloading, cellular information and stress, and we're being programmed. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Like, how much of that do you believe is real for us? And when we're in our mother's womb, for example, and we're maybe inheriting her nervous system, how deep do you think that goes when it comes to the mother-daughter relationship, that we might just be playing out our generational wounding without even realizing it?
Well, I think, Shay, I have a very complicated response to what you're saying. First, I'm not that familiar with that type of theorizing. In other words, the way that I conceptualize it is that the unresolved issues of the previous generation, which includes trauma, it includes families falling apart over particular issues like, how do we deal with our aging mother, that issues that are not worked out and trauma in the previous generations, which includes immigrations, cutoffs, come down the pike, and they get played out in the next generation. Now, that said, listening to you, I am a great believer in genetics, in that we come into the world we all do, with our own unique strands of DNA, and we inherit things from our mothers. I get concerned when, for example, I talk to pregnant women who are going through a terribly anxious time, and they're afraid that they are going to harm their babies in the womb. And there used to be a theory when I was a younger therapist that miscarriages and abortions were due to mothers who had profound ambivalence about having the baby. For me, this brings mother blaming to a new level, and I know it's not what you're in any way saying. I think we have to be careful about giving too much power to mothers, whether how they affect babies in the womb and how they affect babies out of the womb. Because on the one hand, mothers are incredibly important, and it's good to have a good prenatal environment. On the other hand, there are so many other factors that determine who we become. So many factors. And I think that a lot of our theories are based on infantile fantasies about the all-powerful mother. You know, the infant who is at the breast of the all-powerful mother. So my answer to your question is, first, I actually don't know that much about, I hardly know anything about that particular way of conceptualizing. And also that we need to hold two very different things in mind. And one is that mothers are so important. Mothering is so important. And also that mothers are not all powerful. Mothers do not control the outcome. Mothers suffer so much from the idea that their children are little mirrors reflecting back the good and bad job that they've done. You know, holding at once that our mothers are not all powerful, that there are countless forces at work in shaping our lives, and also holding at the same time the amazing importance of the mother and the mother-daughter bond. Does that make sense, Shady?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me, and it's I think it's a really grounded approach, because what I'm hearing you say is you're trying to bring a little bit of balance to this overemphasis of the mother. And I think, you know, from everything that I've been through personally and everything that I've learned about the nervous system, I know that, you know, I did, quote unquote, inherit a nervous system from my mother. And I also know that I've been able to really navigate that and heal that. And I also know that, you know, a lot of my healing happened when I did what you're saying, which is released her from this archetype in my mind and really just gave her permission to be a human. So it's really been a twofold journey for me as well. So I can attest to that, because it was really my unlearning of what I thought a mother should be that freed me to have a healthy relationship with her, just as she is, without her having to change or be different. So I appreciate that you're saying that, because I think that it's an important shift in the mind that has to happen. And it really also liberates us to step into adulthood, I think, in a way, because it allows us a chance to be mature enough to let her off the hook and see her as just a human being, and try to create an adult relationship, one where we are both interested in each other. So I like it. I like it a lot.
And I think, you know, you mentioned being able to accept your mother for who she is. And I think it is an incredibly important step toward adulthood and selfhood to stop trying to change and fix our mothers, because it's not possible. I have been in the business of change for half a century, and I'm really good at it, and I was never able to change my mother. Although we can't change her, that doesn't mean that we don't speak to the differences, that we don't define who we are, because it's so important on this road to adulthood or maturity or differentiation of self, or whatever you want to call it. It's very important that we can say to our mothers, you know, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is how I see things differently. You know, Mom, I see the situation with Dad differently. It makes sense, I see it differently. You're his wife, I'm his daughter. Let me tell you how I see it. And that ability, I mean, it sounds so simple, doesn't it? You know, to say, Mom, I see it differently. You know, let me tell you how I see it. It takes huge courage if it's a hot issue. And it takes huge courage with our mothers to clarify the limits of what we can do or give. to be able to say, a woman, say, that I've worked with in therapy, it was the hardest thing in the world for her to say, Mom, I need to tell you that it won't work for me for you to come and live with me. Mm. And I know that you did everything for Grandma when she was older, and you took her in, and you were with her 24/7. And, I can't do that. And what is that like for you? And how disappointed are you in me that I'm different from you in that way? So I think, I guess what I'm saying, Shay, is that in terms of holding these different perspectives that may seem like opposites, to hold them together, is that we can't change and fix our mothers. Mm-hmm. And our family is the deck of cards that fate gave to us. How we navigate these relationships as adults is up to us. Yes. And distancing, well, sometimes we really need to distance, and fighting in ways that's just really pure reactivity. It doesn't really help us to grow up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then when we can respect differences, but we can also define a bottom line. We can bend like grass and let things go, but we can stand like an oak if we need to say something really important. And having that voice, I think, it's what builds a really solid self that we stand on in all of our relationships.
Yeah, I like that. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about this complicated subject, which is the subject of knowing when to create that distance and that separation, and when to, practice clear boundary setting. Because I think that in our culture, obviously, we're not taught how to have hard conversations, which is quite obvious. But especially, with our parents, when we have these roles that have been kind of predetermined for us within our family system, breaking out of that can feel so impossible. That there are many people who find that the only way is to, distance and cut themselves off from that relationship. And of course, sometimes that is absolutely necessary. I'm not in contact with every single one of my family members for very, very solid reasons. But I think that sometimes we skip the important step of attempting to set a boundary or attempting to, create something different in the relationship. So people often feel guilty or unsure when they get into doing the work on themselves, whether or not they're, running away or avoiding, or whether or not they're setting a healthy boundary. So this is kind of a tough line to walk. How do we navigate that?
That's a really brilliant question. And I have a bias about it. Mm-hmm. I agree with what I think I heard you saying, that we have to protect ourselves first. Mm-hmm. In other words, we need to distance when the emotions that are elicited, upon contact are too painful or too demeaning, or are at our expense. I think at the same time that people move to cut off much too quickly, and without testing out what's possible in the relationship, or, for example, limiting the contact. Cutoff actually is getting more frequent. It will be more frequent at times of high anxiety. Mm-hmm. We're wired for fight-flight, which means that the more chronic anxiety we absorb, the more we are wired to fight and blame, on the other hand, or to distance and cut off, distance and cutoff on the other hand, rather. So I try very hard in my own life and working with people to have them have hard conversations rather than jumping too quickly into, if you're going to treat me this way, you can never come in my house again and you will never see your grandchildren again. In the end, that causes a lot of pain on both sides. And like you say, sometimes it's necessary. But I would prefer that we are first have very creative conversations about, before cutting off.
Yeah. So
and
prioritizing the curiosity piece. Is that what you're saying? Get curious.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a story I would like to tell that I think pulls together a lot of the things we're talking about having a voice. And by the way, temporary distance is a very good thing. Thank goodness for distance. And sometimes we have to take it. Sometimes we have to cut off. But the story I'm thinking of is a woman I was seeing in therapy, and her sister's wedding was coming up. And Joyce is the woman I was seeing. She was planning to attend the wedding with Melody, her partner of 13 years. Back then, there was no marriage for two women. And a week before the wedding, Joyce's mother phoned and said to her, "Remember, Joyce, this is your sister's wedding, so you don't need to bring attention to your relationship with Melody." And Joyce said, "Oh, thanks a lot, Mom. I'll just ask Melody to put a paper sack over her head, to spare you from any embarrassment." And then Joyce hung up the phone. Now, of course, Joyce was angry. Her sister's wedding was being celebrated in grand style. She was being asked to treat her most important relationship like an embarrassing secret. The thing is that she felt that she had stood up to her mother. And actually, she had protected her mother. Confrontation will always, angry confrontation, protect the other person by not taking the conversation further. For example, what if Joyce had taken some deep breaths and asked her mother questions that might really put her mother in the hot seat of having to think rather than react? I mean, what if Joyce said, "Mom, I'm not sure I understand what you mean about bringing attention to my relationship with Melody. Can you tell me a little more about what your concern is? And are there family members at the wedding who don't know, that I'm with Melody? And who do you think is going to have the strongest reaction? And what's your concern?" After talking about this with me, she did something again. This is brave. That she called her mother and she said, "Mom, I know how much stress you're under with the wedding coming up. And I know how upset Grandma gets when she sees Melody and I, in each other's arms or holding hands. And of course you want the wedding to go perfectly. And I do too. But I need to tell you that your comment about my not bringing attention to my relationship with Melody was very hurtful to me. And I am not able to pretend that she is my best friend when she is my life partner." Now, after the wedding, because by the way, weddings or funerals are not the best place to bring up to process hot issues. She actually began to expand the conversation over time because she had been out to her parents for 15 years, but she had never asked her mother one question like, Mom, what's the hardest part for you about my being gay? And how has that changed for you over time? And what is it like for you that your mother blames you, for my being a lesbian? And Joyce was able to ask and to shift into a place of pure listening. We all listen defensively. We listen for the distortions, the exaggerations, the inaccuracies. We listen to plan what we're going to say next. And she really listened to her mother's response to these questions about what was hard for her mother, about her daughter being a lesbian. And afterwards, and after talking with me about it, she was able to speak calmly to the differences. And I'm going to take a drink of water here. Speaking to the differences is one of the most profound acts of courage and differentiation from our mothers. And here's what she said. She said, Mom, I was thinking about our conversations since the wedding. And as I understand it, you think that my being a lesbian is a problem that maybe I was born with and that I can't help the way I am, but that you love me anyway. I have a very different view. When I was first in touch with my feelings towards women, I was scared and I wondered what was wrong with me. And I went through my own process. I want you to know that my relationship with Melody is the best thing that ever happened to me. And if I could push a button and I could magically turn heterosexual, I would never do it. And Mom, I wouldn't do it even if Melody was not in the picture. So what do you think about this difference between us, that you see it as a pathology and it's hard for me, but you love me anyway? And I see it really as a gift. How do you, what's it like for you that we have the difference? Now, I think about her for two reasons, Shay. One is because I know from my vast experience that many women in Joyce's situation would have cut her mother off, would have said to her mother, you stop this crap, and you honor my relationship or you never come in my house again.
Yeah.
And that happens all the time, particularly, as I said, when we're anxious and, having our own hard time. And the story that I told is so interesting because for me, that story has all the elements of having an authentic voice. We can say what we think and feel about things that matter and allow our mothers to do the same. Another part of having an authentic voice is we can also refrain from sharing our thoughts and feelings when we don't have a grip on our own intensity, because intensity and reactivity breed more of the same. Yeah. So, Joyce did, bit her tongue rather than saying like, fuck you, with that business of the wedding. We can ask clear questions about sensitive issues, like when Joyce asked her mother about what was hard for her about having a daughter who was with a woman and how had that changed over time. And also we can listen to understand, which she did. And in the end, really speaking calmly to those differences, that her mother, as polite as she could be about it, saw it as some unfortunate thing that happened. And also that we take a bottom line position, that's a boundary, so we don't violate our core values and beliefs. And Joyce did this when she said, you know, my intention is not to embarrass you, but I cannot pretend Melody's my best friend when she's, you know, my life partner. So, you know, it's an interesting story, and it comes to mind when you ask about distance and cutoff, because, yeah, there are circumstances when we have to cut off because we've tried our best to speak to something painful, and it's only brought us more pain, and we need to take whatever space we need. And I'm just saying, Shay, that I guess one of the hardest things for me as a therapist is I see that cutoff happen all the time when I see a path to a lot more steps that might have taken place if the daughter had the courage to address her mother and keep the conversation going and do it differently.
I love that. It kind of brings up the change back response that you speak of in my mind when I have read all of your books. One of the common themes you talk about is how when we first set a boundary or we try to change the pattern in our family system, there will be a change back reaction, which means that the reaction that we get might not be the reaction that we want.
You're not kidding.
And so in our minds, we might think, oh, well, I tried what Harriet's talking about. Like I tried to have a conversation with my mother. It wasn't possible. You know? So we kind of have to give it some time, and we have to be persistent. It doesn't happen overnight.
And we have to anticipate those counter moves. They're normal. People get anxious when we do something different. And ideally, and I say this is ideal because it's a very mature place to be from, that you don't do it to get results. Of course we want results. You do it because it's the ground that you want to stand on. And you don't get applause when you become more assertive or say something courageous or take a new position. The hardest work I did with my mother, Shay, well, there are other hard work, but one that comes to mind is one very painful thing for me in my family was a triangle with me, my mother, and my father, where my mother would be off the plane and it would take her 5 seconds to have me in the corner and say, let me tell you what your dad has done now. So that the issues she was upset about in the marriage, she was not really dealing with him, but that she, in a very intense way, would come to me with her complaints about him. And I would feel a lot of anxiety. My mother was not an intense person, but around this one issue, wanting me to be in her camp, wanting me to wave her banner, wanting me to not get close to my dad, who, by the way, did a very good job being the person who could be gossiped and criticized about. He was not a gold star father. But that's not the point. So I had some coaching from my family systems coach, and I was going to change my part in this triangle because everything I was doing wasn't working. Like I would sit and listen to it, but I would feel all this anxiety and tension. I didn't want to listen. Or I would argue with her. I would try to argue that my dad was not as bad as she was saying. And, you know, could she see him in this other way or have a bigger perspective on him? And of course, that never works because that only made her want to convince me more fully about what a jerk he was. Yeah. So I planned this conversation where I was going to work on detriangulating myself. I understood that change is a slow, bumpy process.
Yeah.
So my parents were visiting. We were in Topeka, Kansas. My father was in the other room, in the living room, with my husband, Steve, probably being a jerk, and my mother was in the kitchen with me telling me what a jerk he was. And I turned to her in a very warm way. I said, the older I get, I realize I need to have a relationship with both of my parents, and I need to know you from my relationship with you, and I need to know Dad from my relationship with Dad, and let's not give him so much room in the conversation, because I don't know exactly what I said, but I did have it planned out. Sometimes authenticity is not just saying whatever comes into your mind. Sometimes to build the path for an authentic relationship,
Mm-hmm.
you have to do a little planning and
Yeah.
reflection. So I say my very well thought out, detriangulating little piece. And my mother's, well, what do you think my mother said? I mean, do you think she said, "Oh, Harriet, I'm so proud of you because that's really such a mature position, and actually I should not be bringing my complaints to you"?
Mm-hmm.
No. I mean, she looked as if I had struck her, and she said, "You cannot know me if you do not know your dad and what I deal with."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, because I knew, this was a normal reaction. And I said, well, Mom, I do want to know you. I want to know you from my relationship with you. And I want to know Dad from my relationship with Dad. And, she got very intense and said, well, you cannot know the truth about me if you, it was very, very difficult. It was not a one-time detriangulating thing. It came up again and again over years and years. And one of the things I learned, because I studied systems theory, is that if you want to change a pattern, you need to lower your intensity and reactivity, because intensity and reactivity is not only contagious, it consolidates patterns. So I learned to use humor and to, I would say, Mom, if you mention Dad one more time in this conversation, I'm going to come over and give you a poke. Mm-hmm. And then I would change the conversation to art, because she loved to talk about art or something. But the point is, it was always there. When my mother was anxious about anything, the focus, the triangle would get reinstated, and I would be thoughtful about how to respond. And I mean, that's all to say what you were saying. First of all, if you take a new position, a more assertive position, a more differentiated position, if you say, Mom, I know you're not talking to Aunt Jo, but I am, planning to go to her wedding because, I don't know, I would just feel too lonely and to pretend that I didn't have a family member. I mean, whatever the position is that threatens the patterns, the party lines of the family, you do not get applause, So, and you may never get the response you want, but you say it because that's the ground you want to stand on.
Yeah.
Like Shay, I'm thinking, of a client I have, and her whole family is overweight, and her mother calls the family, she says, we're the Fatso family. Okay, Fatso family, get going. We're going to Hypermart. And it's so painful to my client. And she was so brave. And she, just said to her mother, that's very hard for me to hear. And I would prefer, at least in front of me, that you don't call us the Fatso family. And again, she got all the typical responses. Why are you so sensitive? You've talked about being worried about your weight yourself. You're on a diet. Why you're so oversensitive? This is real. We're the Fatso family. And she was able to say, real or not, sensitive or not, I need you to know that when you say this, it hurts me. She then, now courage, at another time when her mother did it. And this is about bringing the conversation to another level rather than cutting off. She said to her mother at a calm time, she said, you know, Mom, I've told you that it's painful for me. It hurts me when you call us the Fatso family. And I told you 3 times, help me to understand why you're still doing it. Is it because you don't believe me when I say it hurts me? Is it because you believe me and you just do it anyway, knowing that it hurts me? Help me to understand this. And her mother responded with some kind of defensive drivel. And my client went over to her and touched her, put her arm on her mother's shoulder and said, I need you to know that when you keep saying this, knowing it hurts me, that you're hurting me, you're hurting our relationship. And I think you're hurting yourself. And I hope you'll think about that. Her mother actually stopped after that. But that might not have been the case. Her mother might have kept on going.
Yeah.
And my client might have taken a position of semi-cutoff by saying, look, I don't want to be hanging around you, when you keep calling us the Fatso family, knowing how I feel about it. But that bringing the conversation to a different level, help me to understand, Mom, that I've told you that it hurts me. And yet you do it for yourself. You were saying how you realized that you weren't here to change your mother, Shay. You weren't here to make her realize that she didn't give you what she was put on earth to give as a good mother. Understanding that we don't do it to change our mothers, although the wish may be there. We do it because we're going to stand on a much stronger platform of self-worth when we can speak without criticizing or blaming or telling our mothers how they need to change.
That was so well said. That was a really beautiful way to end that story. Thank you. I think that really says it all. It's returning to ourselves. It's like returning to our power, and nobody else is going to applaud us. But the reward, I think, is just in feeling secure within ourselves. There's this real unsettled feeling when we're grasping externally for validation or approval or confirmation of our worth. And what you're teaching here is that in order to feel that, we have to give it to ourselves by changing our response to how we show up. And I love that piece that you mentioned around reactivity and intensity kind of seals the deal for a pattern. Can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but I literally had this vision of when we take those pieces of plastic and we use that heat thing to seal them. It's like a little compression, and we wrap it all the way around, and we use heat to make it solid so that nothing can get out, and it's impenetrable. And I think that is such a good example of how reactivity and defensiveness sort of just keeps the pattern going, even though we think that, how to stand up for ourselves or how to express our anger is to be really intense and to be really bold and to be really brass. But what you're proposing is that true empowerment is actually much more quiet and calm, and that is a sign of maturity. And so I love that frame. And it's one that I have found really useful in my own life too. So thank you so much for sharing those stories. I think we're just about ready to wrap up here. So I want to open up for some closing thoughts from you regarding this whole conversation.
Well, I'm very grateful, Shay, because for inviting me. You know, I told you I don't do Zoom. I have turned down every Zoom invitation, except for yours. I'm much better in person. And you have a way that I feel like I've been in person with you. And I know that we, you know, when you were talking before we started Zooming, if that's the proper verb, and you were talking about your personal work and your framework, and I thought, you know, that's such a different framework. It's so, you know, the people you've studied with, the spiritual path, it's very different than my family systems framework. And it made me really admire you for inviting me on the show, because you've read my work and you then know that, you know, the similarities as well as sort of a different, we all see the world through a different filter for all of us that excludes more than it includes. And I just feel very grateful for your openness and giving me this opportunity to tell very long stories. Oh my goodness.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely my pleasure. I mean, I have loved your work for many years now. I've shared it in all of my women's groups, and it's led me down a really beautiful path, actually, to also study family systems work, because I just learned so much from you. I ended up going down the rabbit hole with Virginia Satir's work as well, because I think that, you know, the work that you do is really foundational for everyone. It's your book, The Dance of Anger, is a book that I probably recommend 30 times a week. So it's just such an honor to have the space to talk with you and to hear your thoughts and to share your wisdom with our community. And it means so much to me that you said yes to this, even though it's totally outside of your comfort zone in terms of doing online interviews. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And, you know, I hope that perhaps we do get to do something in person one of these days. So it's just such an honor. And I really look forward to, you know, having an opportunity to share your work more with people. So I'm going to put a list to our audience of your books and anything else in the show notes. And maybe I'll just ask you quickly if there's anywhere people could find you specifically, any direct links you'd like them to go check out.
HarrietLerner.com. I have a website. I'm on Instagram, and I can give you some links. And with your technological advancement, I assume that you could do something with them.
Yeah, we'll make sure that all of your work is accessible in the show notes for this talk.
Great. And Shay, you always have a home in Kansas.
Thank you.
Stranger things have happened. You might find yourself in Lawrence, Kansas.
Well, I might just hop on a plane tomorrow to have tea with you.
That would be great.
If the borders were open, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to having an opportunity to do this again.
Thank you.